In 1853, the great powers of Europe decided they were bored. So they cooked up the Crimean War, a truly spectacular diplomatic train wreck supposedly about protecting Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire squared off against Russia, ostensibly over who got the keys to a church in Bethlehem. Seriously, that was one of the stated reasons. The whole affair was a masterclass in imperial egos clashing over vague principles. Young men across Britain signed up, filled with visions of patriotic glory and heroic cavalry charges. They were about to get an education, not in combat, but in the lethal potential of bad paperwork and contaminated water. This wasn't going to be a war against the Russians so much as a war against common sense, and common sense was about to lose, badly. Britain, ruler of the waves and a global empire, promptly forgot how to pack a lunchbox. The army's supply chain was managed by a department called the Commissariat, which was itself run by the Treasury. Their primary goal wasn't to supply the army, it was to save money. This led to some truly inspired decisions. For instance, they shipped boots for the soldiers, but a huge number of them were for the left foot only. They sent desperately needed medical supplies to the wrong port, thousands of miles away. Green coffee beans were delivered to troops in the frozen trenches with absolutely no equipment to roast or grind them. Meanwhile, Lord Raglan, the British commander who hadn't seen active combat since Waterloo 40 years prior, was busy referring to the enemy as the French out of habit. The whole operation was being run like a badly managed estate sale. Wounded and sick soldiers were shipped from the front lines to the barrack hospital in Scutari, a suburb of Constantinople. This wasn't so much a hospital as it was a palace of pestilence. It was quite literally built on top of a gigantic, overflowing sewer. The floors were rotten, the walls were crawling with vermin, and the air was thick with the stench of infection and despair. 4 miles of beds were crammed into the hallways, often only 18 inches apart. Getting supplies was a bureaucratic nightmare. A warehouse full of clean shirts might be sitting right there, but you couldn't access it without a requisition form, signed in triplicate by a committee that met once a week. Men were dying from cholera while waiting for someone to approve the release of soap. The army had created a perfect system for killing its own soldiers with maximum inefficiency. Let's talk about the state of medicine in the 1850s. Germ theory hadn't been invented yet, so nobody understood that filth and disease were connected. Surgeons, who were more like butchers prized for speed, would perform an amputation, wipe the bloody saw on their coat lapel, and move to the next patient. They saw pus from a wound not as a sign of infection, but as laudable pus, a sign the body was healing. Anesthesia, like chloroform, existed but was used sparingly. The real killers in Crimea weren't Russian bullets. They were cholera, dysentery, typhus, and scurvy. For every 1 man killed in battle, at least 5 died from disease. They were essentially sending thousands of men into a giant open-air laboratory for plagues, armed with nothing but misplaced confidence and the stunning ignorance of basic biology. Into this chaos walked Florence Nightingale. History remembers her as the Lady with the Lamp, a gentle, angelic figure. This is a brilliant PR. The real Nightingale was a fiercely intelligent, socially awkward, and utterly ruthless administrator. She was less of an angel and more of a Terminator sent from the future to eradicate bureaucratic incompetence. She arrived at Scutari with with a team of nurses and immediately started a war not with Russia, but with the army's medical establishment. They refused her help, blocked her access to supplies, and told her to mind her own business. So she used her political connections back in London and the power of the press to publicly humiliate them into action. Her lamp wasn't just for comfort, it was for collecting data on her nightly rounds, data she would use as a weapon. Nightingale's furious letters and damning statistics eventually forced the British government to act. They dispatched a sanitary commission to Crimea in 1855. What this team of engineers found was even worse than reported. The main water supply for the hospital at Scutari was contaminated by the decomposing carcass of a horse. Their solution wasn't some medical miracle. They flushed the sewers, improved ventilation, and whitewashed the filthy walls with lime. They literally cleaned the place. The result? The mortality rate, which had been as high as 42% in a single month, dropped to just over 2%. It turns out the greatest medical breakthrough of the Crimean War wasn't a new drug or surgical technique, it was basic sanitation. The secret weapon against death was soap. It's almost embarrassing. Lest we think this was a uniquely British brand of incompetence, the situation on the Russian side was just as grim, if not worse. Their supply lines were stretched across a vast, unforgiving landscape with virtually no railways. A Russian surgeon named Nikolai Pirogov was a genuine innovator, pioneering the use of anesthesia in the field, employing female nurses, and inventing the plaster cast to immobilize broken limbs. He also developed the concept of triage, sorting the wounded to prioritize treatment for those most likely to survive. This was a revolutionary idea. But even his genius couldn't overcome the systemic corruption and logistical collapse of the Tsarist military. It's a comforting thought, in a way. Staggering administrative failure appears to be a universal human constant, transcending culture and national borders. The Crimean War was, by any rational measure, a colossal waste, but its sheer, magnificent failure had consequences. The scandal forced a complete overhaul of the British Army's administration and medical services. The old system of purchasing commissions was abolished. Nursing was transformed from a low-status job into a trained, respected profession, thanks almost entirely to Nightingale's ferocious advocacy. Most importantly, she pioneered the use of statistics and data visualization to argue for public health reform. Her rose diagrams were a revolutionary way to show that more soldiers were dying in the hospital than on the battlefield. It was a hard lesson, learned at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, that wars are not just won with generals and guns, but with logistics, sanitation, and good data. It just took a cataclysmic medical disaster to get anyone to actually write it down. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!